Yeah, so a really, really warm welcome to Sangha Night. And as Mukshitara said, I know there's a few people here for the first time from the course that finished last Wednesday. So really lovely to see you guys. And yeah, just warm welcome to all of you. So we're just embarking on a new series of talks. We have a theme which usually lasts for about 12 weeks, 3 months. And we're just starting a new theme called Faces of Enlightenment. And I'll explain a bit more about what that means shortly. But yeah, particularly if you've just here for the first time and you've been doing the intermediate course for the last few months, but this also applies for people who've been coming a bit longer. Hopefully you've noticed some positive changes from your Buddhist practice. So you might have in the past, if you've been on this course the past few months, you've been trying out ethics and noticing some of the changes in your life. So you might have, for example, one week tried out generosity for the week and see the impact that that had on your relationships. You might have been trying out the metta bhavana, the mindfulness of breathing, just seeing the effect on your mental states, becoming calmer, more warm, more friendlier, your mind becoming clearer. And you've probably had interactions, if you're here for the newly, with some of the members of our community supporting the course and teaching that course, and hopefully got a flavour of the atmosphere, the kind of warmth, the friendship, the love that kind of pervades our community. And I'm really delighted that you're taking this kind of tentative next step by coming to Sangha Night this evening. But at some point in your engagement with Buddhism, and this may have arisen for you guys already if it's your first night, but it may be yet to arise, and this also again applies to people who've been coming for a while. So at some point with your engagement in Buddhism, a question will arise. And the question that might arise for each of us who've tasted the transformation that's possible through Buddhist practice, the question that might arise is, well, where will this lead me? Where might this lead to? Where might this take me? Where might involvement, engagement with these practices, with this community, where will it lead me? And there's a short answer and a long answer. And the short answer is enlightenment, but that's not much help because it doesn't, we don't really know what that means. So yeah, I'm going to attempt to answer that question. Where will this lead me? Where will this lead you? And in my own experience, trying to answer this question, I was thinking, well, there's some good news and some maybe bad news associated with the question. And the good news is that enlightenment, the state of enlightenment, the goal of Buddhism, is beyond what you can imagine. It's way, way better than anything you can imagine. It's just beyond our imagination, our wildest imagination. If you can imagine the kindest, wisest, most energetic, caring person that you know, it's better than that. It's way, way better than that. If you can imagine yourself at your best, it's way, way better than that. So enlightenment is much, much better, far better than we can imagine. Our minds can't imagine how good it is. It's that good. So that's the good news about where this will take you. But then with that arises, it's not quite bad news because it's all good news really, but some difficulties, you might call difficulties. And interestingly, the bad news or the difficulties is also that we can't imagine enlightenment. You can't imagine, it's beyond our imagination. Enlightenment is beyond what we can imagine. It's better than we can imagine. So we can't fathom it. We can't imagine where this might take us. It's not possible for us to imagine it. And that causes some difficulties. That will create some difficulties. If we can't imagine the goal of Buddhism, there are some potential dangers or difficulties. So firstly, there's the danger that we just drag the goal of Buddhism down to what we can imagine. So we imagine ourselves but a little bit kinder, or we imagine ourselves but a little bit less stressed, a bit calmer. And so we kind of settle for that, and we end up aiming for something kind of far less than our full potential. We're never actually achieving our full potential. What we aspire towards becomes a bit dull and a bit boring, not perfumed by the transcendent beauty of enlightenment, what lies beyond. Or perhaps even worse, what some Buddhist traditions have tried to do to address this problem, to get around this problem of not being able to imagine enlightenment, is they've talked about the goal of Buddhism in largely negative terms, presenting enlightenment purely in terms of what's not there anymore, the absence of something. So they talk about the goal of Buddhism in terms of the absence of craving, or the absence of hatred, or the absence of a fixed, unchanging self. And that's one side of the picture. the transformation, and you might say the kind of the death of our old self, our old habits. That's one side of transformation. The death of the old us, the old self, the old habits. And we call this aspect of Buddhist practice spiritual death in our community. But that's one-sided. That is a one-sided picture of the goal of Buddhism, the kind of the death of our old habits, our old self. But what emerges in its place? What is it that emerges in its place? And if we can't imagine or present a positive picture of enlightenment or what lies on the other side of this transformation, there's a danger of presenting a very negative picture of enlightenment in terms of the absence of anything. It can come across a bit like a void, that there's nothing, very nihilistic. So there's a danger in Buddhism that we can either, instead of having this wildly exciting, amazingly attractive goal of Buddhism of enlightenment, we can either distort it into something which is just very negative and kind of an absence of something, or we can just drag it down and make it very, very dull and boring and kind of, uninteresting, unexciting. Not exciting enough to engage the whole of us, to interest the whole of us, to engage our emotions. So when it comes really down to it, we're not interested enough in enlightenment or in Buddhist practice. When it inevitably gets challenging, if we're not emotionally engaged enough, then when it gets challenging, we're just not going to be interested enough. And the goal of Buddhism isn't going to be attractive compared to all the other goals in life that are available to us. It's going to get drowned out. It's going to lose out in the competition. So 2,500 years ago, there wasn't that problem. There wasn't this same problem. So in northern India, 2,500 years ago, people would hear about a man called the Buddha. They would hear about a man who had gone beyond suffering, who had gone beyond craving, who had gone beyond hatred. And then they would seek him out. They would find out where he was dwelling, and they would seek him out. They would travel to find him. Sometimes they would go on journeys for a very, very long distance to find the Buddha. And then they would meet him, then they would encounter the Buddha. And sometimes the Buddha would give them teachings that would just completely blow their mind, completely blow their minds open. They would be lifted out of their old habits and their old views, and they would get a glimpse of a state of being, a consciousness which is so beautiful, so vast, so mysterious that they would often radically change their lives just instantly. They would kind of drop everything that they were doing and just want to follow him, become a disciple of the Buddha. And sometimes the Buddha didn't need to say anything at all. Sometimes just encountering the Buddha was enough. His presence was enough to really transform and affect people. So there was nothing abstract about the goal of Buddhism for these people. The Buddha was the teaching. He was a living, embodied example of the goal of Buddhism, the full potential of every living being. So I was thinking of an example of this kind of on my own level, my own experiences. I do meet people who are more practiced, more experienced, more developed than I am in our community. And just being in their presence has a real impact on me, some of those people. So I was thinking of Padmavajra, who's the president of our centre, who was here a few weeks ago. And he spent a week around the centre, particularly with the people who work at the centre, but teaching lots of classes, leading lots of study. I met with him. And just the effect when I'm with Padmavajra, it feels like my confidence is raised. I just become more confident in the teachings of the Buddha. I'm already confident, but I become even more confident. His confidence is infectious. And his care for the people is infectious, and his playfulness is infectious, his kind of joy in life is infectious. So just being in the presence of Padmavajra, you just notice that the whole Sangha seems to just get lifted by being in his presence. So there's a phrase from Sangharakshita who says the Dharma, the teaching of the Buddha, the Dharma, isn't taught, it's caught. I think that's very true, actually. We catch the kind of the spirit, the example of Buddhism from other people, from the example of other people. So it's hugely important for the disciples of the Buddha, just being around the Buddha, just being in his presence was hugely important, and they were deeply affected by this, just by being with the Buddha. But sometimes the disciples of the Buddha couldn't always be in his presence, couldn't always be in his company. And there's a couple of stories from the Buddhist tradition which give accounts of this. So there's a householder called Mahanama, who there's a few stories of discussions between Mahanama and the Buddha. But one time the Buddha was staying, in India there's a rainy season, And every year it rains, it just absolutely rains, monsoon kind of buckets down with rain for months and months and months. And everything just stops, kind of work stops and life stops. So the Buddha and his disciples would just stay in one place during the rainy season. So at this particular time, they'd been living near Mahanama, and he had loads of contact with the Buddha. He had loads of time in the presence of the Buddha. But the rainy season was about to end, and the Buddha and his disciples were going to go off on tour, just kind of wandering around, visiting different places. So Mahanama was now no longer going to be staying in the presence of the Buddha. So he went to meet with the Buddha and said to him, well, you're all leaving, you're all going off. Where should I dwell? Where should I abide? And it's an interesting question. And what the Buddha said to Mahanama was, you should abide with the Buddha. You should dwell with the Buddha. And he gave him a practice of imagining the Buddha, mindfulness of the Buddha. And he gave him a series of verses to bring to mind, to reflect on the Buddha and imagine the Buddha. So the effect would be that he would be in the company of the Buddha. He would have the Buddha in his mind all the time. So this was a practice that the Buddha taught to his disciples, to imagine being with the Buddha and be affected by that. And there's another example of an elderly disciple of the Buddha called Pingiya. And Pingiya was, you could just tell from the accounts, was really devoted to the Buddha, really almost in love with the Buddha, just really affected by the Buddha, really devoted to the Buddha. But because he was old and frail, he couldn't follow the Buddha around. He couldn't go wherever the Buddha wanted to. And there's a story of an exchange with his old teacher, who was a Brahmin teacher, Hindu teacher. And Pingiya was kind of singing the praises, saying how great the Buddha was. And you get the sense, well, this Brahmin teacher is almost kind of taunting Pingiya, saying, well, why aren't you with the Buddha now if he's so great? What are you doing here? Why aren't you with the Buddha? And Pingiya's reply is really interesting, really striking. He says in effect, he says, I am with the Buddha. What he says, though, is that I'm old and frail. I can't move around physically with the Buddha. But with the powers of my mindfulness and my imagination and my confidence in the Buddha, I'm always with the Buddha. The Buddha's always in my mind. I'm never separated from the Buddha. And I do this all day and all night, so I'm constantly in the presence of the Buddha. And the Buddha spoke to Pingiya and said, yeah, this is a practice that will take you to enlightenment, that will take you all the way to the end of the Buddhist path. This practice of imagining mindfulness of the Buddha. So obviously, after the Buddha's death, you can imagine how this became an even more important practice for the disciples of the Buddha. The Buddha was no longer physically with them, but the Buddha had given them a practice of imagining being with the Buddha, being mindful of the Buddha, and that having the same effect in a way of being with the Buddha. And you might have had a flavour of this in your Metta Bhavana practice. You can bring someone to mind vividly, and it has the emotional effect of being with them. It's like, if you can imagine them, bring them to mind vividly enough, it's like being with them, being in their company, and you can really cultivate that. As well as the Buddha teaching it and saying this is a path to enlightenment, there's been other recommendations throughout Buddhist tradition. So Buddha Ghosha, who is a very famous Buddhist writer from early Buddhist tradition, he described the effect of mindfulness of the Buddha as being like it turns your body into a shrine room. Your body becomes a temple. And not in a bodybuilding way. It's not a kind of, you don't suddenly get big muscles and become really slim. But your body becomes like a shrine room, like a temple, because the Buddha is present in your heart and in your mind. So you're pervading, you're perfuming the world around you with that kind of atmosphere of the Buddha's presence. So you said your body is like a temple. And obviously this can be a really important practice for us as well, because we're living 2,500 years later. Obviously the Buddha is long dead, he's not around, but we can, in the same way, get a flavour of how we might be able to engage with what the goal of Buddhism might be like. Yeah, we can't, it's unfathomable, it's beyond our imagination, but this gives us an idea of how we might be able to engage with the goal of Buddhism. So imagine if you were in the presence of the Buddha, how would you behave, and what would your mental states be like if you were actually in the presence of the Buddha, if he was here now? Now I was trying to imagine if the Buddha was with me this morning when I was trying to get my children ready for school and nursery, and it's a stressful time of day for me. I wouldn't have kind of been reactive, I wouldn't have kind of been impatient, I would have been kind of calm, I would have been at my best behaviour really, because I've been probably wanting to impress the Buddha, but also you're kind of lifted by the presence of the Buddha. So imagine if the Buddha was with you at work, if you're at work and you've got a difficult meeting coming up, what if the Buddha was with you? How would you behave? What would your mental states be like? What would your communication be like? So you can get a sense, if you can vividly imagine being with the Buddha, evoking the presence of the Buddha, it can have a really positive effect on you. You're engaging emotionally with the ideal of Buddhism. So I've already described the danger is if we can't engage emotionally with the goal of Buddhism, with enlightenment, the danger is we either dragged the goal of Buddhism down to something very dull and boring, or it gets distorted into a kind of negative kind of absence of something. So if we focus only on spiritual death, then it becomes distorted. But actually, there's another practice which is really important in Buddhism, which we call spiritual rebirth. It's a bit sticky. Spiritual rebirth. So if we do engage emotionally with the ideal, if we become attracted to it and moved by it, those qualities of enlightenment get stirred in you, they get activated in you. Reflecting on the deepest potential in all human beings, that potential starts to get activated, starts to get stirred in you. And because of the mystery of enlightenment, it being in a way beyond what we can imagine, our teacher Sangharakshita said, well, it's much more powerful to evoke enlightenment through symbols, through images and mantra than trying to evoke it through concepts and ideas. And we've all had some experience of this, even those of you who've just recently, it's your first night at Sangha night. So those of you who were here on week 3 of the intermediate course will remember we did an exercise where we looked at this image of the Buddha. And we just looked at it and said, well, what does this image communicate to me about enlightenment? And it's amazing, every time we do this exercise, so much gets conveyed, so much gets communicated to people about the goal of Buddhism, about the state of enlightenment. And it was particularly amazing this time. There's a chap who just got so excited by seeing this picture. He just said, this is beautiful, this is amazing. And it really spoke to him. Interestingly, he's not here tonight and I've not seen him since that evening. So I don't know what's happened to him, but he was so excited seeing that is this image of the Buddha. So if you see a really good image of the Buddha, it can convey so much to you. I remember people drawing out just the kind of sense of space and kind of vastness of the Buddha's consciousness, looking at the kind of the area around his head. The groundedness of the Buddha, looking at his hands and his legs and the grass, that the Buddha's really stable and solid and grounded. The connection with the world around him, the kind of almost like he's dissolving into the space around him. So just looking at a really good image of enlightenment can convey so much to us about what that state might be like. So it's really important. This spiritual rebirth practice is a really important aspect of Buddhist practice. Yeah, and another way into this, with images is a powerful way. Another way into it is engaging with stories of the Buddha's life imaginatively. We can read about, I've already talked about a couple of stories about the Buddha encounter and his disciples, and there's so many stories, and if you can engage with those imaginatively, it really can bring alive a sense of what the Buddha was like, his interactions with people. And you do get a sense of the Buddha through those stories. For me, actually, going on pilgrimage to India was really powerful. It brought alive the places where the Buddha lived and taught, the kind of sounds, the scenes, the colours, the people. So, yeah, I'd recommend that. But if you can engage imaginatively with the stories, it can really evoke and bring alive the Buddha. Yeah, so at ordination, as order members, we formally take on a practice to visualize every day an image of enlightenment. So spiritual rebirth practice involves working in all these different ways, through reflection, mantra, stories, visualization. But it's really important to say we don't have to wait until ordination. You don't have to be an order member to engage with spiritual rebirth practice. In fact, you can't wait really. You need to be engaging with it from the outset. It needs to be part of your practice from the outset, because of the dangers I've already highlighted. So during this theme, which is we're going to be exploring over the next 3 months or so, we'll be exploring this area of spiritual rebirth, how to engage in this practice, how to engage in spiritual rebirth in different ways. And in particular, we'll be exploring it through a symbol called the mandala of the 5 Buddhas. So I'll be explaining more about this image, the mandala of the 5 Buddhas, shortly. So enlightenment is, as I've said already, so mysterious, so unimaginable, that if you try and tie it down, the minute you try and grasp it or tie it down, you can't do that. It shifts, it changes. So if you try and zoom into this image of the Buddha in detail, if you really focus on one aspect of the Buddha, it opens up into a set of more complex symbols and images. This image itself is so rich with symbols, but if you really focus on a particular aspect of enlightenment, it's as though you kind of zoom in with a microscope, and what opens up is just more and more detail. So if you really focus on Buddhahood, what opens up is this symbol of five different Buddhas. And I'll say more about this mandala shortly. But it's a family of different Buddhas. It's almost like a Russian doll. If you kind of open up Buddhahood by really going into the Buddha, there's 5 different Buddhas inside there. But if you explore one of those particular Buddhas and zoom into that, there's a whole family of bodhisattvas inside that particular Buddha, and we'll be exploring some of those figures in a theme as well. So it's a bit frustrating. If you try and grasp an image of enlightenment, it just opens up into more images. You can't kind of tie it down into just one image, unfortunately. But that's great as well, actually, because there's so many images of enlightenment that there's a chance that one of them will grab you, one of them will be attractive to you. So that's really good news as well. Yes, over the coming weeks in this theme, we're going to be exploring this symbol, a mandala of 5 different coloured Buddhas, 5 different Buddhas. And we'll be exploring the symbolism, we'll exploring the emotions, the states of enlightenment that they invoke. We'll hear from order members who engage in these practices as well. We'll hear from them about how they engage in spiritual rebirth practice, and particularly with these symbols. But also, we'll be inviting you to engage in this type of practice as well. We'll be hopefully opening this area of practice up for you and inviting you to engage in different ways. But also, just to say, for those of you who are definitely more comfortable with concepts and images, don't panic, don't worry, because we'll also, as we go through this series, be exploring the dharmic themes and lists and the concepts that were associated with these different aspects of enlightenment. So hopefully you won't feel alienated by it. So this evening, by way of introduction, I'm going to be looking in more detail at the very rich symbolism of the Buddha himself, but also showing how if we kind of zoom into one particular aspect of the Buddha or Buddhahood, how it opens out into one of these figures on the mandala, one of these Buddhas in the mandala. So by zooming into this or that aspect of the Buddha, we kind of find ourselves also exploring this or that Buddha in the mandala. And you can look at it the other way around as well. If you find one of these Buddha figures in the mandala attractive and engage with it and cultivate a connection with it, that's a way into a particular aspect of enlightenment, of Buddhahood. So the mandala of the 5 Buddhas, as you can see, contains 5 different coloured Buddhas, one at each of the 4 cardinal directions, north, south, east and west, and one in the centre. So we'll enter the mandala through the east, which frustratingly on this image is at the bottom. So if you imagine it kind of 3D, it's almost like, just imagine that's east. So the blue Buddha at the bottom of this diagram is in the eastern direction. He's the Buddha Akshobhya. His name means unshakable. Akshobhya means unshakable. And next week in particular, Vidanya is going to give a talk just opening up this mandala in much more detail. So this evening I'm just going to give a little hint, a little glimpse of each of these figures and show how it relates to the historical Buddha. But the detail I'm going to focus on, which you can't quite see on that image, but actually if we zoom into this image, this is Akshobhya, deep blue Buddha Akshobhya. And the detail I'm going to focus in is his hand, actually just one of his hands, his right hand, which is touching the earth in the earth-touching gesture or mudra. And you'll notice the Buddha statue we have on the shrine here as well, it has the same gesture, touching the earth. It's almost giving expression to that unshakability, just being rooted, connected to the earth around him. But this relates to a story from the life of the Buddha. So when we get to Buddha Day, if you come to Buddha Day festival, you'll hear read out some mythical stories of the Buddha's enlightenment experience. And this earth-touching gesture relates to part of that story, this mythical story. So some of the Buddha's stories that you can engage with are actual encounters that took place with his disciples and other people. And some of the stories are kind of more mythical stories that evoke the inner experience of the Buddha. And this particular story evokes the Buddha, or just the Buddha about to be the Buddha, on the verge of this breakthrough into this unimaginably different state of mind, this unimaginably beautiful state of mind. And the Buddha's on the verge of this. He's deep in meditation, and he's up against, in conflict with the deep forces that are opposed to enlightenment. And again, just as we embody the goal, personify the goal in Buddhism, these forces that oppose our progress internally within us also get personified as a figure called Mara. So Mara is trying to unsettle the Buddha, to disturb him, to stop him from breaking through. And the Buddha encounters forces of greed, forces of hatred. And then finally, forces of doubt. Mara taunts the Buddha, saying, "Who are you? Who are you to be sitting here meditating? Who are you? Who do you think you are, sitting on this great seat, about to be enlightened?" And in response to this doubt, the Mara internally, you might say, doubting the Buddha and his kind of validity, his credibility to sit on the diamond seat, the Buddha's response in this story is to reach out his hand and just touch the earth. And what the Buddha does in this story, he calls to witness somebody else. And out of the ground, a mythical being appears, who's the earth goddess. And the earth goddess says to the Buddha, or says to Mara, that she's witnessed the Buddha's action, the Buddha's karmic action, and his lifetimes of development and practice. And she witnesses him being ready. So this just evokes a little bit of the Buddha Akshobhya and a little bit of the Buddha in a way that he can't be unsettled. Whatever arises, either in the Buddha's experience internally or externally, it can't shake him, it can't unsettle the Buddha. He's completely unshakable, completely untouchable, really. His mental state's completely untouchable. And this gesture, this mudra, symbolizes that state of enlightenment. Whatever arises externally or internally cannot unsettle the Buddha. So you might experiment that in meditation yourself. If you're experiencing inner forces that are trying to unsettle your meditation, well, you might evoke that sense of unshakability of the Buddha and of Akshobhya. You might even experiment with touching the earth, seeing what effect that has. Just kind of check no one's looking, and kind of, if you feel brave, just touch the earth and see what it feels like. You might, and also you can use images like of a mountain, an unshakable image like a mountain, just to evoke that sense of groundedness and unshakability. So that's just a sense of the Buddha breaking through into this state and overcoming these forces, the unshakability of the Buddha, and a glimpse at the Buddha Akshobhya, who we'll be hearing a lot more about in weeks to come. So after the Buddha's enlightenment, after overcoming these forces, this great inner struggle, the Buddha's consciousness opened up into something, very, very different, as I've said already, a vastly different state of being. Bearing in mind what I've already said about this being unimaginable to us, this state of enlightenment, at least we can say it was an experience full of beauty, rich in beauty, an experience of great peace, of deep inspiration, of love, of clarity, of energy, all of these things unfolding, kind of bubbling up after the Buddha kind of broke through and overcame after this great struggle. And the Buddha spent a couple of weeks just sitting in meditation after this happened, after this momentous experience, just kind of absorbing this, just letting all of this unfold in his experience, this ongoing opening up of deeper and deeper, more and more beautiful states. But the Buddha was acutely aware of the richness, the abundance of what he was experiencing, the beauty of this state of consciousness that had opened up, this abundance and beauty. But also its great mystery. And it said in the stories, the accounts, that he wondered whether anybody else would be able to share this, anybody else would be able to experience this or understand what he was experiencing. Potentially really isolating just this amazing experience, but can I communicate this to anybody? Will anybody else get this? And he had this image for enlightenment, this state that had arisen as being like this kind of pure, beautiful lotus. And in India, apparently, lotuses just grow out of really muddy, dirty pools, but they just look like completely unstained, untouched. So it's like this state of enlightenment had grown out of this really kind of ordinary, mundane state of consciousness, but something completely different had grown, which is so beautiful and pure. And then the Buddha had a beautiful image of the whole of humanity, this vision of all human beings being like lotuses, these beautiful lotus buds with this same potential to grow and become Buddhas, to awaken. The Buddha saw that every single human being has this same potential to experience what he has experienced. But he saw that they were all growing at different stages, and they were all at different stages of development. Some of the buds were deeply kind of stuck in the mud, just starting to poke out deep in the water. Some of the lotuses were starting to kind of grow towards the light in the water. And some of them were starting to burst into flower, just ready to blossom. And the Buddha saw that he could communicate, he could share what he'd experienced with other people, and they would get it, which was great news for us. And that was the start of the Buddhist tradition. But also, we get a glimpse into the Buddha's experience of enlightenment, the beauty of it, the kind of the richness, the abundance and the beauty, and his vision, his wisdom that of the sameness of all humanity, the wisdom that every human being is the same, they all have the same potential. And through this kind of glimpse into the Buddha's experience, we also enter the mandala in the south. Oh, I've forgotten to put the picture up, what a shame. So if you just, I'll go back. This is me doing it in haste. Says, imagine an image of a golden Buddha. There he is. There he is. The golden Buddha in the south, Ratnasambhava. What a shame. I've got a really nice image of Ratnasambhava I have to show you next week. So Ratnasambhava is a golden Buddha, and he symbolizes this richness, this abundance of the state of enlightenment. And this golden colour symbolizes this richness and abundance. And his hand is in the gesture of giving, of generosity. And this symbolises this desire to share this experience with other people, to give it to other people, and the wisdom of seeing the sameness, that every human being has the same potential. So the Buddha lived a life of service of other people, and he taught that his Dharma should be practiced for the welfare of other people. The Buddha taught that we live generously, we live serving other beings. So this aspect of the Buddha is really symbolised and brought out in this figure, which you can't see, unfortunately, of Ratnasambhava, which you could maybe imagine as a beautiful golden Buddha with his hand outstretched in a symbol of giving. So this is the Buddha in the south, Ratnasambhava. Yeah, and one of the things that the Buddha gave, one of the things you might remember from our week in generosity, one of the things that the Buddha gave to the people around him was confidence and fearlessness. The Buddha gave the gift of fearlessness. I think I've hopefully already evoked how that can happen if you're around somebody who is so confident, so deeply confident. Your kind of doubts and your anxieties kind of drop away. You're kind of lifted out of your doubt and anxiety, and you become more confident. You're no longer afraid. And what a gift to be able to give to people, particularly at this time when in our culture there's so much anxiety, so much fear. If we kind of don't buy into that and we can just present confidence, clarity, what a gift that could be to people around us to be able to give that. And it said the Buddha gave this gift of fearlessness. And I've got an image of the next Buddha, the Buddha Amoghasiddhi. The green Buddha Amoghasiddhi symbolises this fearless aspect of the Buddha. So it said that the Buddha was completely without fear, completely fearless. And there was, again, stories from the Buddhist tradition, the time of the historical Buddha, evoke how, in a way, brave and courageous, without fear, the Buddha was. The Buddha wasn't without enemies. The Buddha did make a lot of enemies because his teaching was so radical and counter-cultural in a way that a lot of people were opposed to the teaching of the Buddha. Particularly the Buddha's cousin, a figure called Devadatta. He's a bit like a kind of pantomime villain in the Buddhist tradition. Devadatta, it said, was wanted to kill the Buddha. He wanted to take charge of the Buddhist community, the Sangha himself. So the tradition tells us that Devadatta sent assassins to assassinate the Buddha deep in the forest while he was meditating. But according to the stories, when the assassins encountered the Buddha, they became terrified. They were so intimidated by the presence of the Buddha, his kind of this unshakability, this confidence, his lack of fear, they themselves suddenly became terrified. And it said that the Buddha reassured them, he calmed them down, he gave them confidence and told them not to be afraid. And then he taught them the Dharma and they became his disciples. So they became the assassins. Well, it's quite a funny story. They sent the groups of assassins and they started to wonder what had happened to the assassins. So another group of assassins would go to find them and they become terrified. And then they would become taught by the Buddha and they would become his disciples. And eventually there was no more assassins left. So it's an amusing story, but it just evokes what a remarkable being, what a remarkable mind and kind of presence the Buddha was. There's also a story of, what's the other story? Oh yeah, a mass murderer. So the Buddha was walking through a forest where a mass murderer was living. And he was warned not to go into the forest. He said, you'll get killed. But he wasn't afraid, and he just, in a way, I think, hopefully he might have anticipated that the impact he might have had on this mass murder. So he encountered the mass murderer in this forest who told him to stop, and the Buddha didn't stop. He refused to stop. He just carried on walking, completely without fear. And again, the response of the Buddha so bemused this mass murderer, he kind of couldn't understand why the Buddha wasn't afraid of him. It kind of stopped him. It kind of drew him out of his habits. And again, he became a follower of the Buddha. He was so kind of captivated by the presence of the Buddha. He became a disciple of the Buddha and became enlightened, an enlightened follower of the Buddha. So whatever we've done in life, there's hope for us, basically. The story of Angulimala, the mass murderer, shows, well, actually, the Buddha was true. His vision of life was true. Everybody has the potential to become enlightened. So this fearlessness of the Buddha is evoked more deeply, more richly, you could say, by this figure, this deep green figure of Amoghasiddhi, who's deeply mysterious, but his hand is raised in a gesture of fearlessness, the Abhaya mudra, the Abhaya gesture of fearlessness. And later in this series, we'll be looking at Dharma teachings that help us to look at our own stories that create fear for us, and our own kind of self-limiting stories, how we can overcome our own fear. So we'll be engaging with the figure of Amoghasiddhi and looking at fear. Yeah, so the Buddha was given lots of names, and we'll hear some of these names read out on Buddha Day. It's one of my favourite parts of Buddha Day. We listen to the epithets of the Buddha, the names that the Buddha was given, because it really evokes the character of the Buddha. And the Buddha wasn't his name, actually. It was just one of the titles people gave him. They called him the man who's woken up, because he described himself as having woken up into this state of enlightenment from a kind of a slumber. But he was given other titles, and one of them was Mahapurush, which means the big man. And I really like that. Some people just, they were so impressed by the Buddha's kind of presence that they called him the big man. And for me, it evokes like a character from The Sopranos or from Game of Thrones, maybe. Just kind of the Buddha as this big presence, this big kind of strong, almost intimidating figure. Because you can get presented the image of Buddhism as being very kind of passive and meek and very patient, but actually the Buddha was an intimidating presence. He was completely fearless, and that would really affect people, really transform people as well. Yeah, so we've had a glimpse of a few of the figures now, and behind each of these figures in the mandala, and behind all of these qualities of the historical Buddha I'm talking about, there's a kind of a unifying quality underlying them, that the Buddha himself was just an expression of reality, an expression of the Dharma. He was a living embodiment of truth, of reality, of the goal of Buddhism, just embodied in human form, or kind of almost beyond human form. Yeah, and at the centre of the mandala we find the Buddha Vairocana, a white Buddha at the centre of the mandala, who is a kind of mysterious figure. His name means illuminator, and he sits at the centre of the mandala like the sun at the centre of our solar system. And we could say that it's Vairocana's white light that is kind of split into the different colours of the different Buddhas, like white light gets split through a prism into different colours. So Vairocana embodies the wisdom of the Dharma Dhatu, the realm of the Dharma, and his gesture is the teaching gesture. The gesture of teaching is holding the wheel of the Dharma, which it said that the Buddha began turning the teachings, and as it gets passed from person to person, the wheel carries on turning, this wheel, a great wheel of teaching throughout time. So I'm not going to say too much about Vairocana. He's going to be evoked. He's one of the more mysterious figures at the centre of the mandala, but he's going to be evoked again further throughout this series. So you'll have noticed, if you've been paying attention, I've missed one of the Buddhas out. One of the Buddhas, I missed out the picture of Ratnasambhava. That was a mistake. I didn't mean to do that. But I've deliberately so far missed out one of the five Buddhas in the mandala, the Buddha in the West. And I've done that deliberately because this is the aspect of enlightenment that I'm drawn to, and the Buddha in the mandala that I have taken up as a practice that I meditate on. So I've left it till last because I can probably best evoke the practice of spiritual rebirth by talking about my connection with this Buddha. So yeah, I've already talked about the Buddha's consciousness and enlightenment, the kind of this deeply unimaginable but very, very beautiful state that opened up at enlightenment. But an integral part of this, a key part of this, was love, the Buddha's love for all beings and his compassion for all beings. The Buddha, he resonated with the potential in other beings for enlightenment. He could see how each of them, as well as having that same quality, the same potential to grow into enlightenment, they each had unique qualities. Every human being has a kind of unique character and unique qualities. And the Buddha could see those, and he could see how to draw them out. He could see how he could enter into the unique world of each person and engage with them, help to draw out that potential by entering the world that they inhabit, kind of psychologically, emotionally. So the love of the Buddha meant an intense care and attention towards other beings, and developing a heart that ultimately, well, it's the Buddha taught that ultimately we can develop this heart and this awareness of living beings. And we can connect imaginatively with this aspect of the Buddha, the Buddha in the west of the mandala, the red Buddha, Amitabha. So the red colour is the colour of warm emotion, of love, of compassion. And his hands are in the meditation gesture, probably the most famous, maybe alongside with the earth-touching gesture. You most often see a Buddha meditating with his hands in the meditation gesture. It's the kind of classic garden centre Buddha image where you kind of see a Buddha meditating with his hands like this in the meditation posture. Yeah, so red is the colour associated with warm emotion, and it said the time of all the Buddhas in the mandala appear at different time of day, and Amitabha's appears at sunset. So at sunset you get the warmth and the heat of the sun. You kind of get warmed up and kind of enjoy, particularly if you're in a hot place, not like maybe in Sheffield, but if you're in the Mediterranean or somewhere warm and it's sunset, you can enjoy the warmth and be nourished by that without the kind of fierce heat and intensity of the sun. It's kind of more accessible. And this represents, it symbolises the kind of caring, nurturing love of the Buddha, of Amitabha, that we're trying to develop in Buddhist practice, but without the kind of damaging heat of craving and attachment and possessiveness. So Amitabha represents this kind of a more accessible, warm, a kind of slightly cooler, softer warmth and care and attention, but without that damaging heat of attachment. And Amitabha's name means boundless light, infinite light, boundless light, and he has a boundless heart of love for all beings. So I formally took on the sadhana, the visualization practice of Amitabha at ordination. I was ordained by Amoghavanksa, and he initiated me into this practice, gave me this practice of Amitabha. And so and there's lots, I'm going to go talk about Amitabha later on in this series, so I'll save some of what I've got to say about Amitabha for that talk. But there's a lot I could say about my connection with Amitabha, and particularly, maybe I will share this story. I've shared it already, but just after just before my private ordination, I was meditating, doing a puja, actually a ritual, but trying to decide. I was experiencing a bit of doubt myself. Which Buddha visualization should I take? Should I ask for, or should I take? And I remember asking myself 3 times, what practice should I take? And each time I got a very clear answer of Amitabha, which is the practice I was expecting to take. But I was experiencing a bit of doubt. But I opened my eyes in the kind of hut where we were meditating, and the room was just filled with a beautiful red light. And I looked out of the window, and the whole valley where we were dwelling was filled with this beautiful red light. And it was an amazing sunset, the most beautiful sunset I've ever seen. The whole sky was red everywhere. And my public preceptor, Satyaraja, whispered in my ear, Amitabha, that's a good sign. So it was a kind of an auspicious sign. And hopefully what we can invoke over the next few weeks is the kind of richness of this practice of engaging with these symbols. It's a very rich practice. It's full of mystery and full of beauty. But and I'll say more about this at the end, but my experience and the experience of lots of others is we're not just engaging with a kind of blank symbol like a picture. It's much more mysterious and kind of rich than that. So at ordination, we take a formal practice which we do every day to visualize a particular Buddha or Bodhisattva figure. And it can often be, in a way that's sometimes all we say about it, and it can seem that spiritual rebirth and visualization is something you have to just wait for till you're an order member or ordination. But that's such a shame in a way, because it's not like that. If you think this is something only for order members, it's not like that at all. It's true that the formal practice gets taken up at ordination. That has to happen in a ritual context. It only has that kind of power and impact if it's taken up in that way at ordination, handed down from person to person. But as I said earlier, we need to begin engaging our imaginations, engaging our emotions with the goal of Buddhism from the outset. Because if not, the goal of Buddhism either just becomes really dull and boring or gets distorted. And there's so much richness, so much beauty that can get opened up by this practice of spiritual rebirth. So what I want to do just very briefly is just end by talking a bit about how my relationship, my association with Amitabha kind of developed. I kind of connected with Amitabha from the point of becoming a Mitra, actually. And sometimes it can also seem the other way around, like Amitabha has been cultivating a connection with me since that time. So, it's a bit mysterious. And what I want to do is just to evoke some of the ways that over the next few weeks, when we're engaging with these symbols, that you could be, in quite a practical way in kind of daily life, engaging with this practice of spiritual rebirth in your own life and just seeing what effect it has for you in different ways. And again, I'd for some reason, I think I'm slightly poorly and I'm a bit slightly disorientated, because I'd meant to write up a really nice list of these different ways, but instead I'll read them out and you can try and remember them or write them down. So the first way that you can engage with spiritual rebirth practice is mantra. And mantra has and remains for me really important. I think maybe part of it is my background as a musician. I spent a lot of time engaging with music growing up. So sound for me is very important. Sound is very powerful for me. And mantra is the kind of sound form of these images of enlightenment. The mantra contains that same rich symbolism, but in kind of sound form. And I remember basically at my Mitra ceremony, which is a long time ago now, but we chanted the Amitabha mantra, and basically I was hooked from that point, really. The mantra just evoked such beauty for me, such beautiful states, and seemed to kind of transport me into such a beautiful space that I was hooked from that point, really. I just thought, there's something about this mantra. I was kind of fascinated by it, captivated by it. So mantra is one way that you can engage with these figures over the coming weeks. We might introduce you to some of the mantras, and you can engage with them in that way. Also, colour and light is a way to engage with Amitabha. Actually, I've got another picture of Amitabha, which I'll show you. This is a picture, which is a huge picture in the Padmaloka Shrine Room. A lot of these pictures come from the Padmaloka Shrine Room. This is a huge image of Amitabha, which is it's a lot smaller here, but actually a lot bigger in real life. And another way I engage with Amitabha is through colour and light, red light. Part of the practice involves seeing the sun setting over water, so there's a kind of red light and golden light on the surface of water. So whenever I see sunlight on water, immediately it evokes Amitabha for me. The colour red it's been a significant colour for me in lots of different ways. And I'm tempted to talk about my association with Liverpool Football Club, but I think maybe I have got a really strong connection with red. It really evokes something for me. So you might find, you might explore which of these colours is one of the colours that interests you. Have you got a favourite colour? Is one of these Buddha figures have a particular colour, that one of these symbols that grabs you? And then another way into this, to spiritual rebirth practice, is mindfulness of the Buddha or a particular Buddha figure. I meant to say this earlier. Typically when mindfulness gets taught these days, it gets taught in terms of anapanasati, mindfulness of the breath, or satipatthana, mindfulness of the basis of mindfulness. But actually, buddhanasati, meditation of the Buddha, mindfulness of the Buddha, was, as I evoked earlier, a really, really key part of mindfulness of the Buddha. And that gets completely left out of mindfulness teaching, unfortunately. But you can practice this, you can engage with mindfulness of the Buddha, evoking the presence of the Buddha. Try and do it. And this is going to be, I'm going to set you homework for the week. This is your homework for the week, is see if you can cultivate mindfulness of the Buddha in your daily life. What impact might that have on your behaviour in situations, in your mental states? If you're relatively new to Buddhism and that doesn't seem powerful enough for you, maybe cultivate a sense of somebody that you really respect and admire, and just think, well, how might you behave if they were with you in that challenging work situation. So you can do the metta bhavana, and I might do the metta bhavana with a sense of being with Amitabha, and it's just a lot easier. It's a lot easier to do the metta bhavana with Amitabha than doing it by myself. You can do the mindfulness of breathing, and we're going to do this after the break. I myself and Mokshitara, our leader, a mindfulness of breathing in the presence of the Buddha, so you get a sense of what that might be like. So that's another way into it, is this mindfulness of the Buddha that you can practice in daily life. There's also mudra, the gestures, the symbols, the hand symbols that I've talked about. You can use those in meditation. So I've at the moment using the mudra of Amitabha a lot in meditation, just putting my hands in the meditation gesture. And that is really connecting me with the figure of Amitabha. You might, as I mentioned earlier, try the earth-touching mudra or the mudra of generosity. You try these out and just see it. There might be this symbol captivates you, one of the symbols captivates you in this way over the coming weeks. But there could be other symbols. With Amitabha, there's the symbol of the lotus family, and also the peacock. Strangely, the peacock is a symbol associated with Amitabha, which I haven't engaged with that much, but it's kind of curious for me. So we'll hear about some of the symbols associated with these figures and see if any of them capture your attention, your fascination. Another way of engaging with spiritual rebirth is, well, what are the aspects of enlightenment that these figures personify? So for me at the moment, what's become particularly important about my practice with Amitabha is calmness, the calmness of meditation. Amitabha is seated in deep meditation. He's in the meditation posture, his hands are in the meditation mudra. So he's completely calm, completely still, deep in meditation. So that when I'm evoking Amitabha myself or reflecting on Amitabha, trying to cultivate a sense of being in the presence of Amitabha, it's that sense of calm is one of the things I'm really trying to connect with at the moment and cultivate in myself. And then also warmth, Amitabha's warmth and love and friendliness is another aspect that I'm trying to connect with and cultivate, this kind of boundless heart of kindness and love. And particularly, as I mentioned in the morning, when I'm trying to get my children dressed and ready for school and they're just running around laughing at me or kind of fighting with each other, it's like, can I evoke those qualities of calm and stillness and kindness and friendliness and warmth? It's like I really need those in that situation. So you can engage with spiritual rebirth practice in this way. Can you evoke that figure and evoke those qualities when you need them? And then there's the wisdom of the Buddhas. So trying to see through the eyes of that particular Buddha, see the world with that perspective of that particular wisdom. So we'll be exploring and engaging with the different wisdoms. I've already talked about Ratnasambhava's wisdom, who sees the sameness of every human being. Well, you could bring that into your metta bhavana practice. That difficult person that winds me up has the same hopes and fears that I do, has the same potential for enlightenment that other beings do. And Amitabha sees the unique qualities of individuals. He sees their unique brilliance, their unique kind of characteristics, their uniqueness. So I try and see people's potential in that unique way through the eyes of Amitabha. Okay. So maybe the last two might seem the most kind of, or the least accessible, the kind of most weird, but in a way, over a long period of time, this is something that will become more, if you connect to these figures over a long period of time, what will develop is a kind of fascination, a love, a relationship with these figures. And you can cultivate this through devotional practice, through having a shrine, having images of these figures. So over a long period of time, kind of a fascination, a love really kind of cultivate. And my experience of doing the Amitabha practice is that I receive blessings almost. I receive kind of inspiration from Amitabha. I receive nourishment from doing this practice. I do the meditation practice, and there's such beauty, such richness in this practice that gets evoked, that gets stirred. It really lifts me, really inspires and nourishes me. There's such beauty and richness in the practice. So, I mean, you might get a taste of that. I hope you do get a glimpse and a taste of that almost those blessings, that kind of richness and beauty. But that certainly can be cultivated over a period of time, the connection of the fascination, the devotion, and the sense of being in receipt of something very, very beautiful. Okay, so Yeah, hopefully just giving you a flavour, you can see that the roots of these 5 Buddhas can be found in the historical Buddha, and they all relate to the 5 Buddhas in the 5 Buddha mandala that we'll be exploring, all relate to different facets, different aspects of enlightenment. The enlightenment experience kind of zoomed in into more detail, into particular aspects. And so Vidanya will be opening this up more next week. And you can see them as aspects of your own potential. As I said earlier, it's like this kind of deep potential within all human beings. It's deep potential within you getting activated, stirred up by these very rich symbols, very mysterious symbols that we can't grasp, we can't pin down. But as I was just evoking with my own association with Amitabha, for people who really engage with spiritual rebirth practice in a serious way, it seems more than that, it seems more mysterious. That it does seem like there's a kind of something in reality that we're engaging with, an aspect of reality which is deeply beautiful, deeply mysterious. Something kind of here and now in reality that we can engage with, and it is very much alive. So anyway, throughout this series, you're welcome to engage with it either way, in both ways. You can see these as kind of symbols, stirring, activating qualities, emotions in you. You can see it as a kind of something more alive, more mysterious, if that works for you. So we're going to split up into groups, and we're going to just explore what is the goal of Buddhism for us, and what do we make of the Buddha of enlightenment? What is the goal of Buddhism for us, and anything else that comes out of that talk. After the break, as I said, we'll come back in here and we'll have a practice of the mindfulness of breathing in the presence of the Buddha, so you'll get a taste of that.